Let's delve a little into the Burns history, shall we? No, Burns of London. Iconic 60s brand of the British invasion. A little bit rare over here. I don't see very many of these things. Certainly not of this vintage. The man behind the name, James Ormston Burns, born 1925 in Washington, Newcastle upon Tyne. He played the steel guitar. He trained in woodworking and metal fabrication and various industrial arts, and who decided in the late 1950s to come up with some designs for solid body electrics. He briefly teamed up with a couple of amplifier companies before deciding to set out on his own and create what was basically the first commercially produced solid body guitars in Britain. Remember, we're still in that post-war austerity and rebuilding period. The guitars available to British players were often pretty rudimentary, not a whole lot of money floating around either. So you might get maybe a mid-grade Hofner or other Continental brand, but a Strat or a Gibson? No way. Practically impossible. So there was a bit of a vacuum for decent instruments. Burns came up with a number of designs. The most well-known is probably the Black Bison, which is vaguely Strat-shaped, but with really exaggerated, enlarged, inward curving horns. You know, they were slightly enlarged body sizes too. They're big, blocky, really bold aesthetics. And Jim actually managed to secure an endorsement deal with Hank Marvin and the Shadows in the early 60s. Very influential instrumental group. Their biggest hit being Apache. They're sort of like the English equivalent to the Ventures. A whole lot of bands took inspiration from them. So it was kind of a coup. For their part, it was sort of a patriotic sentiment, probably. But it was apparently a pretty good partnership for a few years because the Shadows were very picky. Marvin kept sending instruments back for refinement because they weren't getting it quite right every time. And it sort of forced Burns to up their QC game. So they became quite refined. Before they got that kind of ringing endorsement, Burns really couldn't ignore the entry-level segment of the market because it was, where the money was. And they came out with the Sonic series here in 1960. They're obviously Fender-inspired, but they've got other elements like this sculpted heel transition and a set neck, which is very different. Later on, they also came out with bolt-on necks as well. The Sonic bass here is a short scale. I think it's 30 inches. Not super inexpensive, but maybe within reach of the semi-serious player. It was around 44 pounds. Right, you want to be in a show band? You get down to the music store, you purchase a Sonic bass, we'll have you drive up and down the M1 for a few months, we'll give you threepence a night, a fish paste sandwich, and a packet of crisps to be eaten in the van. If you do well there, we might see about booking you into Skegness in June for the weekends. Jim Burns didn't really have the kind of business mind that was going to keep the company floating long term, And in 1965, Baldwin, a US brand, came looking to buy him out. They were in the market for a guitar company. They'd also been in the running to buy Fender, but didn't get that deal. So they took over the operation from him, and it limped along through the end of the 1960s. But Baldwin had also managed to buy Gretsch in the interim, and they put more resources into that brand. So in 1970, it was all over. Jim Burns kept on going, though. He started another company under his own name again in the mid-70s and continued building. That again fizzled out, and a new iteration came about in the 90s, which is still going strong. And they, follow very much in the tradition with some upgraded stuff. So you can still buy Burns guitars. This guitar was purchased by the current owner's grandfather in the 1960s. And again, I'm not an expert, but I believe that this is an early example. And from what I can deduce, it was made in late 1960 or early 61. There's a good web page at blackguitars.com that describes and shows some of these changing features. I'll leave a link in the description. First, it has smooth, cream-colored knobs, which were changed to a metal alloy in 1963. Next, it's got the Sycamore light-colored fingerboard. This was changed to rosewood in 1962. On the headstock here, the three tuners that are original are the Dutch-made Van Gent tuners, but they're unmarked. Early 1960 examples are branded with B&H, which stands for Boozy and Hawkes, which were a big English music publishing company, an importer. In 1961, the monogram there seems to be gone. Early examples have this T section strap button. By 1962, they've got the more usual trumpet shape. The big thing is the pick guard. The first ones were injection molded and had these rounded edges. But sometime in early 1961, they were changed to a sharp chamfered sort of bevel edge. And the really unique thing about this one, something I've not seen on any other example online, is this white overlay scratch plate which extends down through the control section. They're usually short and confined to an area around the tug bar, up here. Is this something they played around with for a day or two before deciding that it was too much white? Who knows? But the screws on it and everything else seems right and original. Those of you who are into Queen and the guitar stylings of Brian May might know a little something about his red special guitar, the one which he constructed with his father. You'll know that it has a set of these Burns trisonic pickups in it. This, of course, is the bass version of that pickup. It's marked on the cover plate. And yes, I know that this thing is going to dominate the comment section with references to torture. This bridge is adjustable for both height and intonation with these screws. And the pictures I've seen online, there is an original cover plate that would go over top of this. It's kind of squarish and rectangular, not unlike what you'd find on a P bass. Funny thing is, I don't see holes drilled through this scratch plate for it. And the ones I've seen online have screws on either side to attach it to the guitar. Don't know what that's about. There are scuff marks on either side, which suggests that maybe there was some kind of press fit cover or something. I don't know. But yeah, like a cheese grater. And this thing is just remarkably lightweight for a bass. I gotta get some batteries for my scale so I can figure this stuff out. But, you know, it feels like the average Squire made with a basswood body, you know? It's just, it's featherweight. So we're just gonna make it play as good as it can play. Start off with, the action height is pretty atrocious. It's around 9/64 on the bass side, 10/64 on the treble. The neck is a substantial piece of work, pretty chunky. Feels good if you've got hands my size. And although it doesn't have an adjustable truss rod, it's supposed to have steel reinforcement. However, this thing has got a gargantuan amount of relief. Like more than 40 thousandths, full millimeter. So, yeah. I don't know if we can do something about that. I'm going to try. Okay, let's plug in, see what happens. Lots of volume out of the neck pickup. Slightly scratchy control. I believe these are set up volume, volume, and tone. Less exciting for the bridge pickup. That's kind of quiet. Yeah, the tone kind of works. Sharp-eyed viewers are going to notice that these strings, especially the bass ones, kick over distinctly to the left as they reach the saddle here. And they're not actually sitting in the groove cut central to the saddle itself. So there seems to be a secondary notch that's been filed in these to hold them slightly away from where they should be. I haven't tried it yet, but I suspect if we put those strings in the place you expect them to go, that we're going to end up with, yeah, that bass string would really want to slip right off the corner, and it's playing directly over top of the bevel on the ends of the frets. So that's a bit of an issue. The U-section base of the bridge has really squashed forward and collapsed, even more so on the treble side. It'll be interesting to see if this thing intonates anywhere close to where it should. Whew. Maybe not, eh? It's not good when you can bury the needle. So with every string playing incredibly sharp, these all have to move back a considerable amount, probably like a quarter of an inch or so. We'll see. Unstringing this is probably a bit of a trick because the string ball ends, they don't go into slots. They go through a hole in the back portion of the plate here, which means I think you basically have to disassemble the whole thing before you can take the strings out. A bit of the old British Jaguar engineering, circa 1958. What? Yeah, don't do this in a hurry. I think I have to remove this screw. Which actually is turned down to fit in a slot. What? Wow. Diabolical. Yeah, the hole through the plate is not really big enough to accept the end wraps on these strings. So I think this is compressed over time, making it a go, no-go situation. So I may be cutting these and probably boring those holes out a drill bit or two to see if I can make them a little more user-friendly. When I was 11 years old, I used to go over to my friend Peter Leadbeater's house, and his father, who was an aeronautical engineer, had, I think, like a 1962 Triumph Bonneville motorbike set up inside his office, inside their house, because he'd been slowly restoring it for a period of like 15 years. And it was always this kind of thing. You have to make sure the parts go back together in the same order that they came off, because they're probably not interchangeable. You can see just how twisted this thing is. Also the interesting off-centered mounting screws. Actually, I don't think this bridge lasted more than a couple of years. I believe it was changed over to a more conventional top-loading design. Again, this was an era when Fender's patents were still pretty new and defensible, you know? So you couldn't go too far into their patented territory. You had to come up with reverse-engineered kind of stuff like this. Okay, some grounding wires under there. That's good. Been marking the associated strings on the bottom here. I'll do it in marker now. I may in fact etch those in deeper with some kind of tool later on. These parts don't appear to be plated. I think that's just straight up steel. Got to be careful with these little flathead screws because they appear to be brass. Many of them appear to be in holes that are stripped. Like they don't go into the wood, but the holes that are in the plastic are so tight around them that they're not going to come out. I'm not sure whether any of these are actually accessible underneath this white thing. I expect not, because there's not a cavity under it that I can see. So I guess maybe the whole plate has to come off. Yeah, be careful with these old plastics. Yeah, it's all self-contained. Nice. These are Italian-made pots, made by the Lessa company. I'm going to try and use the neck heater to pull a little bit of that excess relief out of the neck. To be honest, this is the most I've seen a neck bow. I'm not sure how successful this is going to be. Any improvement is good, of course, but we're in extreme territory here with like a full millimeter of relief. This is just a electrically heated rectangular section heavy aluminum tube, basically, with thermal resistors glued on the inside. It heats up to about 170 degrees Fahrenheit. There are standoffs on either side, so there's negative space because I have to push this into a back bow, a fairly significant back bow. What's happening here is a combination of both heating up the glue so it becomes semi-plastic, and also just literally heating the wood and trying to rebend the wood to try to find some of its previous memory. So this gets controlled by a DC power supply. So I let it heat up for a while before I apply pressure using my clamp, and then gradually cinch it tighter and tighter till that back bow is achieved. Then I turn it off and I'll let it sit for a day and see what happens. I've been thinking about what to do with this bridge. I know there will be comments about tetanus shots. Let me remind you that the tetanus bacterium lives in soil, primarily, and rust is not really part of the equation unless the metal it's attached to has been kicking around outside. Still, I've had my booster shots, and I suggest you do too. But I would say, if someone wanted to use this as an everyday base, it could happen. But especially if, say, fresh strings are part of their sound, I'd say maybe remove this and put on an aftermarket top-loading bridge and keep this in the case for posterity. But, you know, that's not what's happening here, and I think we're going to keep it. I'm going to try and straighten out this base plate. But to be honest, when I do that, you know, first of all, I'm going to be able to gain some extra intonation room, which I'll probably need. But it's probably also going to lose a little bit of that beneficial downward angle that this was providing, and the action might actually get higher. So what I'm thinking is I'm going to soak this stuff for a while in evapo-rust, which is a relatively benign solution that removes rust. And then I might want to go ahead and grind down the tops of these saddles a little bit, which will both help lower the action, and I'll also be able to re-slot them and get good spacing, and maybe even ease the corners a bit, so there's less chance of doing irreparable damage to the tendons in your hand. Just keep telling yourself it's not urine. It's not urine. Just finished rinsing these off. They stayed in solution for about 8 hours, and it did a really good job. All the rust is gone. They still have the appearance of old steel. Now I'm going to hit these with some T9 from Bow Shield, which is an anti-rust protectant used in the aerospace industry. It's a lubricant, and it really does sort of penetrate into the surface and prevent future rusting. This is great for old steel Telecaster saddles and that kind of thing as well. I'll try and hammer out some of the worst of the deforming. I'll try and pull out some of the warpage as well. You got to be careful with this because there's only so many times you can bend and rebend steel, right, before it goes snap. I'll file the saddles back to clean steel and take a little bit more height off of them. I'm going to clean up these pots. They're in really incredible shape, actually. This jack is new. It was changed over about 25 years ago when this thing came out of storage. Apparently the original was either a smaller barrel, like a 3.5 mil barrel, or I think I've seen some of them that actually had integral patch cords. There is some fuzz, which is actually connecting the first lug and the second lug. Now, it doesn't seem like it, but depending on the components in that fuzz, that might be enough to cause an issue. Shorting things out, at least partially. You can also see that this pickguard is sort of hollow underneath. There's a lip all around the edge, which means there's an air gap between the top of the guitar and the bottom of the pickguard. That also means that the bridge, when it's sitting on here, there's that gap, and you're basically crushing the plate in the center, which has led to this crack here. I'll put some glue on that. There is a small piece of plastic on the top of the guitar in this area designed to take up the space, but it can't do it perfectly. I'll ease all the corners on the bridge components and try and make them look more at home on, say, a Mark IV Lee Enfield than a very old piece of farm equipment. The heat press did virtually nothing to the neck, So I'm just getting rid of some high frets here, trying to influence things in the right direction, but it's kind of a lost cause. Recrowning, polishing, not once, not twice, but thrice. I'm marking the saddle spacing on the saddles with a stretched piece of dental floss because it's nice and thin and gives me an accurate way of figuring out where the strings will line up against the sides of the fretboard. I'll file the string grooves. Here's the tip. In order for a 0 fret to function, the strings actually have to touch it. So I have to refile the nut slot there. Alright, I've reached a point. It's a frustrating one again for me because there are too many small problems that are interdependent and adding up to a very big problem. And it was all sort of hinging on the ability to make that neck straightening procedure work. I've managed to lower the action by about a 32nd of an inch, which is about 20%, and that's significant, but it's not really what you'd want. 7/64ths, 8.5/64ths. Not great. I've improved the intonation by an even bigger factor. However, I can't take the strings down any further or adjust them any farther back without, maybe pulling the bridge off, drilling new holes and repositioning it. And that's all kind of moot because there's still a huge amount of bend in the neck. That gives us the classic problem of a ski jump in the higher frets, so that as you move up the board, you're always going to have the string bumping into the next fret higher. And getting the frets into one plane is impossible because the depth of the relief is still greater than the height of the frets. So I'd need to pull them all out, dress the surface of the board, and then refret it. The electronics are a lot cleaner sounding now, but the disparity in output between the two pickups was not really affected very much. There may be a winding issue in the bridge pickup, and unfortunately this is something that's happening more and more with guitars in this vintage. As the insulating coating on the wire, it's that very thin hair-like wire that makes up the coil, it's got a lacquer on it, and it starts to break down, and you end up with sort of shorting out portions of the pickup, which means a decrease in output. Can they be rewound? Sure. But in the face of all the issues involved together, is it worth it? We basically end up having to rebuild everything to make it functional and probably change the actual character of the bass. Life would be a lot easier if this had a bolt-on neck and a fender bridge. Tackling one or two of the issues makes sense, but altogether it just doesn't. So, it's going to end up being fun to plunk away with on the neck pickup up to about the 12th fret. Other than that, it's a piece of British music history, but as a useful instrument, it's got serious limitations. It's still light as heck and kind of fun to play though.